The alley was quiet, shrouded in shadows, as the girl stepped cautiously forward. The faint sound of rustling echoed from somewhere nearby, sending a shiver up her spine, her eyes scanning the darkness for the source of the noise. Then she saw it, two faint specks of light reflecting in the gloom. Her breath caught as a shape emerged from the shadows, its outline ragged and still. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice trembling. Emily took a step closer, her pulse pounding, and that's when the growling started. Before we continue, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and tapping on the notification bell. Comment below for more intriguing, emotional, and inspiring stories. It was the middle of a cold, gray afternoon when Emily first spotted the dog. She had been walking home from her after-school job at the corner bakery, her breath curling into small puffs in the chilly air. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few cars rumbling past and the occasional person rushing by with their coat collars turned up against the wind. Emily's mind was elsewhere, on homework, on the bills that always seemed to pile up in her tiny apartment, on the dull ache of loneliness that had taken root in her life since she'd moved to the city. She didn't expect anything unusual to happen that day, but then she saw him. The dog was small, scrappy, and clearly out of place in the urban sprawl. His coat, a mix of black and brown patches, was matted and dirty. He limped slightly, his back leg stiff, as he sniffed around a pile of trash bags outside a closed deli. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart clenching at the sight of him. He looked up then, his eyes locking onto hers. They were wide, golden brown, and filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He was thin, so thin that she could see the outline of his ribs beneath his patchy fur. Emily hesitated. She wasn't the kind of person who stopped for stray dogs. Her life was barely in order as it was. She worked long hours, barely scraped by on minimum wage, and lived alone in a studio apartment that couldn't possibly accommodate a pet. But something about the dog held her there, rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, his head tilted slightly to the side, or the way his tail gave a hesitant wag, as though he couldn't quite decide if he trusted her. Whatever it was, she couldn't bring herself to keep walking. Slowly, Emily crouched down a few feet away from him, pulling the sandwich she hadn't finished earlier out of her bag. She tore off a piece and held it out, her hand trembling slightly from the cold. The dog didn't move at first. He stared at her, his body rigid and ready to bolt. But after a long, tense moment, he took a cautious step forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Emily stayed perfectly still, whispering soft words of encouragement. Finally, the dog darted forward, snatched the bread from her hand, and retreated a few steps to eat it. "Hey, buddy," Emily said softly, tearing off another piece. "You're hungry, huh?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but he crept closer again, his movements slow and tentative. Emily fed him the rest of the sandwich bit by bit, her heart aching with every bite he swallowed like he hadn't eaten in days. When the food was gone, he lingered, his nose brushing against her hand. She reached out slowly, letting him sniff her fingers. To her surprise, he let her touch him, his fur rough and tangled under her hand. "You don't belong out here, do you?" she murmured. Emily didn't plan what happened next. Before she could talk herself out of it, she slipped off her scarf and looped it gently around the dog's neck like a makeshift leash. "Come on," she said, standing up. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The dog hesitated, his tail wagging nervously, but when Emily started walking, he followed. It was as though he had decided, in that moment, to trust her completely. Back at her apartment, Emily did her best to make him comfortable. She filled an old mixing bowl with water and laid an old blanket on the floor for him to sleep on. He drank greedily and then curled up on the blanket, his eyes fluttering shut almost immediately. Emily watched him for a long time, her chest tight with a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She didn't know what she was doing or how she was going to take care of him, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave him out there alone. The days that followed were a blur of adjustment. Emily named the dog Max, and he seemed to take to it quickly, his ears perking up whenever she said his name. She brought him to the vet, where she learned he was a little under 2 years old, malnourished but otherwise healthy. The vet also mentioned, somewhat cautiously, that Max appeared to be a mix of several breeds, including German Shepherd and something she couldn't quite pinpoint. "He's got a lot of personality," the vet said with a smile as Max wagged his tail furiously at her. Emily started taking Max on walks through the neighborhood, and the change in him was immediate. He went from a timid, wary stray to a happy, energetic companion who trotted proudly by her side. Neighbors who had never so much as nodded at Emily before now stopped to comment on how handsome Max was, and kids on scooters would wave and shout, "Hi, doggy," as they zipped past. For the first time since she'd moved to the city, Emily didn't feel so alone. But things weren't always easy. Max had quirks, some of them endearing, like the way he insisted on sleeping curled up at the foot of her bed, and others more challenging, like his occasional bursts of aggression toward other dogs. Emily chalked it up to his rough start in life and worked hard to train him, using treats and patience to build his confidence. Slowly but surely, Max became her world. She couldn't imagine life without him. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and Emily was walking Max through the quiet streets near her apartment. The air was crisp, and the sidewalks were empty except for the occasional car passing by. Max was alert, his ears perked and his nose twitching as he sniffed at the shadows. Emily had learned to trust him. He was usually calm and friendly, but when something made him uneasy, she paid attention. They were rounding a corner when Max stopped abruptly, his body stiff. He let out a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She followed his gaze and saw a figure standing in the alley ahead, partially obscured by darkness. The person didn't move, but something about the way they stood, their shoulders hunched, their head tilted slightly toward her, set Emily's nerves on edge. "It's okay," she whispered to Max, though her voice shook. "Let's go this way." She tugged gently on his leash, but Max didn't budge. His growl deepened, his lips pulling back to reveal sharp teeth. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure in the alley took a step forward, the faint glow of a street lamp catching the edge of their face. They were smiling, a thin, unnatural smile that made Emily's stomach twist. Then, without warning, Max lunged. The leash slipped from Emily's hand as Max charged forward, his growl turning into a ferocious snarl. The figure stumbled back, their smile vanishing as Max launched himself at them with a force Emily didn't know he possessed. The sound that followed, a mix of growls, snarls, and the figure's startled cry, echoed through the empty street. Emily ran after them, shouting Max's name, her voice frantic. But by the time she reached the alley, it was too late. Max stood over the figure, his body rigid and his fur bristling. The person lay motionless beneath him, their eyes wide with terror. Blood stained the pavement, pooling beneath them in a dark, glistening puddle. Max turned to look at Emily, his golden brown eyes glowing in the dim light. There was something in his gaze, something wild, something that didn't belong to the gentle dog she thought she knew. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her mind racing. She had saved Max that day on the street, but now, as she looked into his eyes, she couldn't help but wonder, had she made a terrible mistake? Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as Max stared at her, his muzzle glistening red in the faint glow of the street lamp. The figure beneath him didn't move, their chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Emily took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Max, what did you do?" Max's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't move. His body was still taut, poised over the fallen figure like a guard ready to strike again. The golden glow in his eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at her with such trust, now burned with an intensity she didn't recognize. Emily's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself closer. "Max," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "Come here. Now." For a moment, she wasn't sure if he would listen. Then, slowly, Max backed away from the figure, his growl fading into a low whine. He sat down a few feet from the alley's entrance, his tail tucked between his legs as though he knew he'd done something wrong. Emily's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she knelt beside the person on the ground. It was a man, his face pale and streaked with blood. His eyes fluttered open, meeting hers for just a moment before closing again. "Help," he rasped, barely audible. Without thinking, Emily fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting harsh shadows across the alley. Emily stood to the side, clutching Max's leash tightly as officers swarmed the scene. Paramedics crouched over the man, their voices calm but urgent as they checked his pulse and applied pressure to the gash on his arm. "What happened here?" an officer asked, stepping toward Emily. His tone was professional but firm, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Max. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I was walking my dog," she stammered. "We saw the man in the alley, and Max, he attacked?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "Did the man threaten you or your dog in any way?" Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. I don't think so." The officer glanced back at the paramedics, then at Max. The dog sat quietly at her side now, his head lowered and his tail curled around his feet. He looked nothing like the snarling, wild animal he'd been just moments ago. "Is this your dog?" the officer asked, his gaze sharp. "Yes," Emily said quickly. "I rescued him a few weeks ago. He's never done anything like this before." The officer's expression didn't soften. "You'll need to provide his vaccination records, and we may have to quarantine him for a few days while we investigate. If the victim decides to press charges..." "Charges?" Emily interrupted, her voice rising in panic. "Max was protecting me. I didn't even..." "Ma'am," the officer said, holding up a hand. "We're just gathering information right now. We'll need to take statements and assess the situation fully before making any decisions." Emily wanted to argue, to defend Max, but the weight of the moment crushed her. She nodded silently, gripping the leash tighter as the officer took her information and walked away. That night, the apartment felt suffocating. Max paced the small living room, his claws clicking against the hardwood floor. He seemed restless, his ears twitching at every sound from the street below. Emily sat on the couch, her head in her hands, replaying the events of the evening over and over. Why had Max attacked? The man in the alley hadn't done anything to provoke him, or had he? Emily couldn't shake the memory of the man's unsettling smile as he stepped forward, but she couldn't tell if it was real or something her mind had conjured after the fact. Max finally stopped pacing and sat down at her feet, resting his head on her knee. Emily looked down at him, her heart aching with confusion. His eyes were soft again, filled with the same trust and affection she'd seen the day she brought him home. He looked like the dog she knew, but now there was a question gnawing at the back of her mind. Who is Max really? The next morning, Emily woke to a knock at her door. She opened it to find the same officer from the night before standing there, his expression serious. "Good morning, Ms. Harper," he said. "I need to ask you a few more questions about last night's incident." Emily nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Max was lying on the floor nearby, his ears perked as he watched the officer warily. "The man your dog attacked, he's stable now," the officer began. "But he's not cooperating. He refused to press charges or even give us a statement about what happened." Emily blinked, confused. "He refused?" The officer nodded. "It's unusual, but some people prefer to handle things privately. That said, we still have concerns about your dog's behavior. A mandatory quarantine may not be necessary, but we'll need to monitor him closely." Emily nodded quickly. "Of course. Max is a good dog. I don't know what got into him last night." The officer studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I'd recommend being cautious. Dogs can sense things we can't sometimes, but it's still your responsibility to control him. If there's another incident, there could be serious consequences." After the officer left, Emily sat on the couch, staring at Max. He tilted his head at her, his tail wagging slightly, but she couldn't bring herself to smile. Something about the man's refusal to press charges didn't sit right with her. It felt like a missing piece of a puzzle she didn't even know she was solving. Over the next few days, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Mac. He became more alert, his ears flicking toward sounds that weren't there. He spent long stretches staring out the window, his tail still and his eyes sharp. At night, he paced the apartment, occasionally letting out low, rumbling growls that made Emily's skin crawl. And then there were the dreams. Emily started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with no memory of what she had been dreaming about, only the lingering feeling of unease. One night, she jolted awake to find Max sitting at the foot of her bed, staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Max?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't move at first, his gaze locked on hers. Then, slowly, he tilted his head, his expression softening. He wagged his tail once, the sound breaking the eerie stillness of the room. Emily tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. Something wasn't right. And deep down, she was starting to wonder if Max's actions that night in the alley had been less about protecting her, and more about something else entirely. Over the next week, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max's behavior continued to change in subtle but undeniable ways. He became hyper-alert, reacting to sounds she couldn't hear and pacing the apartment as though guarding it from something unseen. He refused to settle down, even during their walks, constantly pulling on the leash as if he were searching for something. And then there was the way he watched her. At times, Max would sit across the room, his golden-brown eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She wanted to believe it was affection, that he was simply being protective, but something about his gaze felt different now, like he was waiting for something, though she couldn't imagine what. One evening, as Emily sat on the couch flipping through her mail, she noticed Max stiffen. He had been lying on the floor near the window, but now he was on his feet, his ears perked and his body tense. "What is it, boy?" she asked, looking toward the window. Max let out a low growl, his eyes locked on the darkened street below. Emily's heart began to race as she stood and moved closer to the window, peering out into the shadows. At first, she saw nothing, just the usual rows of parked cars and the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. But then, she noticed a figure standing near the corner, half hidden by the shadow of a tree. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, facing the building. Emily's stomach tightened as she took a step back from the window, her pulse quickening. "It's probably just someone passing through," she said aloud, trying to reassure herself. But even as she said it, she couldn't ignore the chill creeping down her spine. Max growled again, louder this time, and Emily tugged the curtains shut. She turned on the TV to fill the silence, but the unease lingered long after the figure disappeared. The dreams got worse. Each night, Emily woke up gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat. The dreams were vivid but fragmented, filled with flashes of snarling teeth, glowing eyes, and a voice she didn't recognize whispering her name. Every time she opened her eyes, Max was there, sitting at the edge of the bed or lying just within arm's reach, his gaze steady and unblinking. One night, she woke with a start, her heart pounding. She sat up, wiping her damp forehead, and turned to find Max lying on the floor next to her. But something about the way he was positioned caught her attention. His head was turned toward the bedroom door, his body tense, as though he were listening for something. "Max," she whispered. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. Emily's breath hitched as she followed his gaze toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty, the apartment silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She reached down to touch Max, and he finally looked up at her, his ears twitching. He wagged his tail once, but the movement felt forced, like a reflex rather than genuine happiness. Emily frowned, her unease deepening. A few days later, Emily decided to retrace the events of that night in the alley. The man Max had attacked refused to press charges, and the police had closed the case, but Emily couldn't let it go. She needed answers, not just about what had happened, but about why Max had reacted the way he did. She took Max on a walk through the neighborhood, her heart pounding as they approached the alley. Max was on high alert, his nose to the ground and his ears swiveling constantly. When they reached the spot where the attack had occurred, he froze, his body rigid. Emily looked around, scanning the area. The alley was empty now, but it felt different, heavier somehow. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "What is it, Max?" she whispered. Max didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a darkened doorway at the far end of the alley. Emily squinted, trying to see what he was looking at, but the doorway was empty. "Come on," she said, tugging gently on the leash. "Let's go." Max resisted for a moment, his muscles tense, but then he relented, following her reluctantly as they continued down the street. Emily glanced back over her shoulder, her unease growing. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the man from the alley. She had only seen him for a few seconds before the chaos unfolded, but the image of his face was burned into her memory. His pale skin, the strange tilt of his head, and that unsettling smile. She wondered why he hadn't pressed charges. What kind of person would be attacked so viciously and then refuse to speak about it? She didn't have answers, but one thing was certain: Max had seen something that night, something she hadn't. The following week, Emily's life took another strange turn. She was at work at the bakery when a man entered the shop, his presence immediately unsettling. He was tall and thin, with sunken cheeks and piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were neat but outdated, as though he had stepped out of another decade. Emily froze as he approached the counter, her stomach twisting. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was just passing by," he said, his tone smooth and measured. "I heard you were the one who rescued that dog." Emily's breath caught. "What? The dog?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Max, isn't it? You found him not far from here." Emily's pulse quickened. "How do you know that?" The man's smile widened. "Small town," he said simply. "Word gets around." Something about his voice, his posture, sent a shiver down her spine. She gripped the edge of the counter, forcing herself to stay calm. "He's my dog," she said, her voice firmer now. "Is there something you want?" The man's eyes flicked toward the back of the shop, then back to her. "No," he said after a pause. "Just curious. Have a nice day." With that, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. Emily stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know who the man was or why he seemed so interested in Max, but she knew one thing. She wasn't imagining it. Something was happening, and it wasn't just about Max. It was about her, too. Emily couldn't shake the man's visit from her mind. The way he had spoken about Max, as though he knew more than he should, left her feeling exposed. Vulnerable. She spent the rest of her shift distracted, her eyes constantly darting toward the door as if expecting him to return. But he didn't. When she finally got home that evening, Max was waiting for her as usual, his tail wagging as she stepped inside. For a moment, his excitement felt comforting, familiar. But as Emily knelt to scratch behind his ears, she noticed something that made her breath catch. There was dirt on Max's paws. Thick, dark streaks of soil that hadn't been there when she left that morning. She frowned, running her fingers lightly over his fur. It was damp, and there was a faint, acrid smell clinging to him, like he'd been digging in something foul. "Max," she said softly, pulling back to look at him. "Where have you been?" Max tilted his head at her, his tail wagging again, as if he didn't understand the question. Emily sighed and reached for a towel to clean him up. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that maybe he'd just rolled in some mud during their morning walk. But the unease wouldn't leave her. Max had been acting strange for weeks now, and she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that there was more going on than she wanted to admit. That night, Emily's dreams were worse than ever. She found herself in a dark forest, the trees towering over her like shadowy giants. The air was thick and damp, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of growling. "Max?" she called, her voice echoing through the stillness. The growling grew louder, closer, and suddenly she was running, her heart pounding as she pushed through the underbrush. The forest seemed endless, the shadows shifting and closing in around her. And then she saw him. Max stood in a clearing up ahead, his back to her. His fur glistened under a strange, silvery light, and his body was tense, his ears flattened against his head. "Max!" she shouted, relief flooding her. But when he turned to face her, Emily's relief turned to terror. His eyes were glowing, not the warm, golden brown she knew, but a brilliant, unnatural red that seemed to burn with its own light. His lips pulled back into a snarl, revealing teeth that looked sharper, longer than they should have been. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" He lunged at her. Emily woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She sat up in bed, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. She glanced toward the foot of the bed, where Max usually slept, but he wasn't there. "Max?" she called softly. There was no answer. Heart pounding, Emily climbed out of bed and padded into the living room. The light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, everything looked normal. Then she saw the front door. It was open. Emily's stomach dropped. She hurried to the door, her pulse racing as she peered outside. The street was empty, the air cold and still. "Max?" she called again, her voice rising. A soft growl echoed from the alley across the street. Emily's breath hitched. She hesitated, her heart thundering in her chest, but then she stepped outside, her bare feet cold against the pavement. She crossed the street quickly, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Max?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The growling stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then she saw him. Max emerged from the shadows, his fur matted and his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He stared at her, his body tense, and for a moment, Emily felt a pang of fear so sharp it made her legs go weak. "Max," she said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "What are you doing out here?" Max didn't move. He just stared at her, his gaze unblinking. And then she saw it. The dirt on his paws wasn't just dirt, it was mixed with something darker, something wet and glistening. Blood. Emily's stomach churned. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you do?" He let out a low, rumbling growl, and Emily took a step back, her heart hammering. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have taken him." Emily whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The man from the bakery stood at the edge of the alley, his pale face partially obscured by shadow. "What?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "He's not just a dog," he said. "You don't know what he is, do you?" Emily shook her head, her mind racing. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling. He's my dog. I saved him." The man's smile was thin and humorless. "You didn't save him," he said. "You woke him up?" Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Max and gave a slight nod. Max's growl deepened, and before Emily could react, he lunged. Max lunged, and Emily barely had time to throw herself backward, stumbling against the alley wall. His growl filled the narrow space, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through her chest. She stared at him, wide-eyed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't her dog, not the gentle, loyal Max she had brought home. This was something else. The man didn't flinch as Max snarled, pacing toward Emily like a predator closing in on its prey. "You don't understand," the man said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "He's not what you think he is. You never should have taken him." Emily's voice trembled as she shouted, What are you talking about? He's my dog. The man gave her a cold, pitying look. He was never yours. Max is different. You saw it, didn't you? The way he watches, the way he reacts. He's not just protecting you. He's hunting. Hunting, Emily whispered, her back pressed hard against the cold brick. You're insane. The man shook his head slowly. You've felt it. The dreams. The unease. The way he changes when you're not looking. You didn't find Max. He found you. He needed someone to bring him back. Emily's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but nothing fit. Bring him back from what? She demanded, her voice breaking. The man stepped closer, his expression grim. From what he is. Max isn't just a dog, he's something ancient. Something powerful. You let him in, and now he's waking up? Emily glanced at Max, who had stopped pacing and was now staring at her with those unsettling, glowing eyes. Her heart pounded as she remembered all the strange moments over the past weeks, the way he had growled at nothing, the dirt and blood on his paws, the man in the alley. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to see started to click into place, and she felt a wave of nausea. What does he want? She whispered. The man's gaze darkened. You? Max growled again, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. Emily's chest tightened as she stared at him, trying to find some trace of the dog she loved in the creature before her. Max, she said softly, her voice trembling. It's me. It's Emily. For a moment, Max hesitated. His ears twitched and his growl softened. His eyes, still glowing faintly, flicked between Emily and the man. She thought, hoped, she saw a flicker of recognition, a trace of the dog she had known. See, she said, her voice cracking. You're wrong. He's still my dog. He's still Max. The man sighed, shaking his head. You're trying to reason with something that doesn't think like we do. He's not making choices, Emily. He's following instincts older than you can imagine. The words barely registered before Max lunged again. Emily cried out, bracing for the impact, but the man moved faster than she expected. He stepped between them, raising his hand in a sharp, commanding gesture. Stop, he barked. To Emily's shock, Max skidded to a halt mid-lunge, his claws scraping against the pavement. He growled low in his throat, pacing in frustration, but he didn't attack. The man turned to Emily, his face pale but determined. I can keep him at bay for now. But you need to understand, Max is bound to you. You're the one who brought him back, and that connection gives him power. Emily shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. I didn't bring anything back. I just saved him from the street. The man's expression softened slightly, but there was no relief in his eyes. You think it was chance that you found him? He chose you, Emily. He needed you to let him in. Now he's tied to you, and if you don't stop him, he'll destroy everything. Emily's heart pounded, her mind racing. Stop him how? The man hesitated, glancing at Max, who was still pacing, his eyes never leaving Emily. It won't be easy, he said quietly. You'll have to sever the connection. And that means letting him go, for good. Letting him go? Emily repeated, her voice trembling. The man nodded. Completely. He'll try to resist, and it won't be safe. But it's the only way to stop him from finishing what he started. Emily's chest tightened as she looked at Max. He had stopped pacing now and was sitting on the pavement, his head tilted slightly as he watched her. For a moment, he looked almost like the dog she had known, almost, but the glowing eyes betrayed the truth. I can't, she whispered. He's my dog. He's all I have. The man's gaze hardened. If you don't, he'll take more than just you. He'll take everyone around you. That's what he's meant to do. You're the one who has to make the choice. Tears blurred Emily's vision as she stared at Max. She thought of the day she'd found him, cold and scared in the street. She thought of the way he had curled up at her feet, the way he had wagged his tail when she said his name. He had been her companion, her friend, the one bright spot in her lonely life. But now, as she looked into his glowing eyes, she realized that the dog she had loved might be gone, or worse, might never have been real at all. "Max," she whispered, her voice breaking. He whined softly, tilting his head as if he understood her pain. The man stepped forward, his voice steady. "Do it now, before it's too late." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for Max's leash, her heart shattering with every step. He stood as she approached, his tail wagging hesitantly, as though he thought this was just another walk. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." As she reached for the clasp on his leash, Max let out a sudden, furious snarl. His body tensed, his glowing eyes blazing, and Emily felt a wave of heat and fear wash over her. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Now, Emily! Let him go!" With shaking hands, she unclipped the leash. Max froze for a moment, his growl fading into a low rumble. He looked at her, his eyes glowing brighter than ever, and then he turned and bolted into the darkness. Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing as the man stood beside her, silent and grim. "He's gone," she whispered. "He's really gone." The man placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "You did the right thing. But this isn't over. He'll be back. And next time, you'll have to be ready." Emily looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with fear. "What do you mean?" The man's expression darkened. "Max isn't just a dog. He's a piece of something much bigger, and it's only just begun." Emily sat on the cold pavement long after Max disappeared into the shadows, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. The leash dangled limply from her hand, a painful reminder of everything she had just lost. Her chest ached with a hollow, raw pain that felt unbearable. Max had been her only companion in a world that often felt too big, too empty. And now, he was gone, not just physically, but in a way that felt final and irreversible. The man stood nearby, his presence a constant weight. He watched her in silence, his expression unreadable, until Emily finally found the strength to speak. "What did I just do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You severed the connection," the man said, his tone flat. "It was the only way to stop him, for now." "For now?" Emily repeated, looking up at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "You said he'd come back. Why won't he just leave me alone?" The man sighed, crouching down so they were eye level. His pale face was lined with something that looked like regret, or maybe guilt. "Because he chose you," he said quietly. "Whatever Max is, whatever force he's tied to, it's bound to you now. You let him in, and that bond doesn't just disappear." Emily shook her head, her voice rising. "I didn't let anything in. I was trying to help him. He was just a stray. I thought I was doing the right thing." The man's expression softened slightly. "You couldn't have known. They never tell you what they are, not until it's too late." "They? What does that even mean?" Emily demanded. The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Max isn't unique. There are others like him, beings that walk among us, hiding in plain sight. Some of them are harmless, content to stay hidden. But others are hunters. They're drawn to people who are vulnerable, people who will trust them enough to let them in." Emily's stomach churned. "Hunters? What are they hunting?" The man's gaze darkened. "It's not always clear. But with Max," he trailed off, standing up and glancing down the alley where Max had vanished. "He's dangerous. And now that he's out there, he'll keep searching for what he wants." "And what does he want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The man looked at her, his eyes cold. "You?" The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. Emily stayed home from work, keeping her apartment locked and double-checking the windows every hour. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were worse than ever. They were filled with shadows and glowing eyes, with snarls that echoed in the dark and the sound of claws scraping against the floor. Every noise from outside sent her heart racing. She jumped at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, flinching every time a dog barked in the distance. But no matter how much she tried to push the memory of that night away, Max was always there, lingering in the back of her mind. The man hadn't left her completely alone. He returned the day after the incident, knocking softly on her door. When she let him in, he explained that his name was Caleb, and that he'd been tracking Max, or whatever Max truly was, for weeks. He wasn't supposed to stay with anyone for long, Caleb said, sitting at her small kitchen table while Emily paced nervously. The kind of bond he created with you, it's rare, but it's strong. That's why he'll come back. Emily stopped pacing, crossing her arms over her chest. You keep saying he chose me. Why me? What makes me so special? Caleb hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. It's not about being special. It's about being open. You were vulnerable, lonely, maybe even a little lost. That's what they're drawn to. They find cracks and they slip through them. Emily bristled, her voice sharpening. You make it sound like I'm weak. I'm not weak. I didn't say you were, Caleb replied calmly. But they have a way of seeing things in us that we don't always see ourselves. Max needed a way back into this world, and you gave it to him. Emily sank into a chair, her head in her hands. So, what now? She murmured. Do I just wait for him to show up and, attack me? Kill me? Caleb leaned forward, his expression serious. Not if we're ready for him. Emily looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means we find a way to break the bond completely, Caleb said. Not just sever it temporarily, but destroy it, destroy him, before he can hurt you or anyone else. Emily's chest tightened. You're talking about killing him? Caleb's jaw clenched. It's the only way to stop him. No, Emily said firmly, standing up. I'm not going to let you hurt him. He's still Max. He's still, she faltered, her voice breaking. There's still a part of him that's good. I saw it, Emily, Caleb said gently, but firmly. I understand what you're feeling. But whatever good you think is in him, it's not real. It's a mask. The Max you knew was never real. He was always this. Emily shook her head, her throat tightening. I can't believe that. I won't. Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. If you want to survive this, you're going to have to. That night, Emily sat on the couch, staring at the leash that still lay coiled on the coffee table. It felt like a relic of another life, a symbol of the bond she had thought she shared with Mac. She thought about his wagging tail, the way he'd rest his head on her lap, the joy she'd felt when she saw him waiting for her at the door. Had it all been a lie? She didn't know what to believe anymore. Caleb's words lingered in her mind, but so did the memory of Max's hesitation in the alley, the way he'd wagged his tail, even after everything. Maybe Caleb was wrong. Maybe there was still something of Max left, something worth saving. As the clock struck midnight, Emily made a decision. If Max came back, she wouldn't run. She would face him, and she would find out the truth for herself, no matter the cost. The apartment felt unbearably quiet in the hours that followed. Emily sat by the window, staring out into the darkened street, her fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. She had turned off all the lights except for a single dim lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. It felt like the silence itself was watching her, pressing in closer with every passing moment. Max was out there somewhere. She could feel it, not in the logical way that told her he might return, but in something deeper, something visceral. The bond Caleb had mentioned, it wasn't severed, not really. Emily felt it like a string tied between them, stretched thin but unbroken. She told herself she'd recognize the moment he came back, that she'd be ready. When Caleb knocked on her door earlier that evening, she had refused to let him in. If Max comes back, she had told him firmly, I'll deal with him myself. Caleb had stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, before finally nodding. Don't wait too long to call for help, he had said. Emily didn't respond. She closed the door, slid the chain into place, and locked it. Now, as midnight ticked past, she sat in the gloom of her apartment, waiting for the inevitable. It was nearly 2 a.m. when she felt it. The air in the room shifted, an almost imperceptible weight that pressed down on her chest and sent a chill skittering up her spine. Her breath hitched and she froze, her ears straining against the silence. For a long moment there was nothing, and she wondered if she was imagining it. Then she heard the faintest sound, a soft scrape like claws on pavement. Emily's heart began to race, but she didn't move. She stayed by the window, her eyes locked on the street below. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift, darker than they should have been, and then she saw him. Mac. He was standing in the middle of the street, his head lowered and his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His body was rigid, his muscles taut like a coiled spring, but he didn't move. He simply stood there, staring up at her window. Emily felt her chest tighten. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. As if he had heard her, Max tilted his head slightly. His ears twitched, and for a moment, his glowing eyes softened, just enough to make her hesitate. But then he took a step forward, and the illusion broke. Emily scrambled to her feet, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached for her phone but stopped herself. She had made her decision. She would face him alone. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the door and stepped out into the hallway. The air outside was bitterly cold, stinging her cheeks as she crossed the threshold onto the street. Max was still standing there, just beyond the glow of the nearest street lamp. His body was a mass of shadows and sharp edges, his fur bristling in the faint light. "Max," Emily called softly, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her gut. At the sound of her voice, Max stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His glowing eyes locked onto hers, and Emily felt the weight of his gaze settle over her like a heavy blanket. "You came back," she said, her throat tight. "I knew you would." Max stopped a few feet away from her, his head lowered but his tail wagging faintly. For a fleeting moment, he looked almost normal, like the dog she had rescued, the companion who had made her feel less alone. "Max," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "If there's any part of you left, I need you to stop this. Please." Max whined softly, tilting his head again. But then his eyes flared brighter, and the sound turned into a low, rumbling growl. Emily's heart sank. She took a cautious step back, her fingers curling into fists. "Don't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I know you're still in there. I know it." Max lunged. Emily screamed, throwing herself to the side as his claws scraped the pavement where she had been standing. She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving as Max turned to face her again, his teeth bared. The glow in his eyes was blinding now, pulsing like embers in a dying fire. He growled, the sound vibrating in her bones, and Emily realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't just about her. Max wasn't hunting her out of malice or anger. He was following a purpose, something far older and darker than she could comprehend. She reached into her pocket, fumbling for the small flashlight she had brought with her. When she clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, making Max flinch. "Stay back," she shouted, aiming the light at him. Max growled again, his body tense, but he didn't advance. The light seemed to disorient him, and for a moment, Emily saw hesitation in his glowing eyes. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to be this." Max let out a low, mournful sound, almost like a whine. For a brief, fleeting moment, Emily thought she saw the dog she had loved, the dog she had saved, emerge from behind the glowing eyes and the snarls. But then Max stiffened, his ears flattening against his head. A shadow moved in the corner of Emily's vision, and she turned just in time to see Caleb stepping out of the darkness, a long, silver object glinting in his hand. "No!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking. Caleb didn't hesitate. He raised the object, a blade long and curved, and stepped toward Max with purpose. Max growled, his body coiling as he prepared to strike. "Stop!" Emily screamed, stepping between them. The sudden movement startled both Caleb and Max. The blade hovered inches from Emily's chest as Caleb froze, his face twisted in frustration. "Emily, get out of the way!" Caleb barked. "No," she shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. "I'm not letting you hurt him." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's not what you think he is. You can't save him." I have to try, Emily said, her eyes filling with tears. I have to. Caleb hesitated, his grip on the blade tightening. Max stood motionless behind her, his growls fading into soft, rhythmic breaths. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding. Max, she said softly, stepping closer. If you're still in there, I need you to stop. Please. Just stop. Max's glowing eyes met hers, and for a moment, the light in them dimmed. He whined softly, his body trembling. Emily reached out a hand, her fingers shaking. Come back to me, she whispered. Please. Max hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, lowering his head to press his nose against her palm. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a flicker of hope. But then, behind her, Caleb muttered, You've made a mistake. And before Emily could react, the world erupted in chaos. The chaos happened all at once. Caleb lunged forward, his blade slicing through the air with a bright, silver arc. Max reacted instantly, his body coiling as he shoved Emily aside with surprising force. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, just as Max and Caleb collided. The growls and snarls that erupted from Max were unlike anything Emily had ever heard before, deep, guttural, and primal. Caleb grunted as he struggled to hold his ground, the silver blade gleaming in the moonlight as it flashed between them. Emily scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Stop, she screamed, her voice hoarse. Both of you, stop. Neither of them listened. Max was relentless, his glowing eyes blazing as he snapped at Caleb with teeth that seemed impossibly sharp. Caleb moved with practiced precision, ducking and weaving, the blade in his hand cutting through the air with deadly intent. Emily's mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Caleb's words echoed in her mind. He's not what you think he is. You can't save him. But even now, even as she watched Max fight with an unnatural ferocity, she couldn't bring herself to believe it. Max, she shouted, her voice cracking. Stop. Max froze. His head snapped toward her, his growl fading into a low whine. His glowing eyes softened, the blazing light dimming as he stared at her. For a moment, everything was still. Caleb seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, the blade aimed directly at Max's chest. No! Emily screamed, throwing herself between them. The world seemed to hold its breath. The blade stopped inches from Emily's chest, trembling in Caleb's hand as he froze, his face twisted with anger and frustration. Emily, he said through gritted teeth. Get out of the way. No, she said, her voice shaking but firm. She turned, placing herself fully between Caleb and Max. I won't let you do this. Do you understand what he is? Caleb shouted. What he'll do if you let him live? I don't care what you think he is, Emily shot back, her eyes blazing. He's my dog. He's Max. And I know there's still something good in him. Max whimpered behind her, his glowing eyes dimming further. He lowered his head, his body trembling, and Emily reached out to place a hand on his head. It's okay, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm here. I've got you. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he lowered the blade. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Maybe I am, Emily replied, turning to look at him. But it's my mistake to make. Caleb hesitated for a long moment, his expression torn. Finally, he stepped back, sliding the blade into a sheath hidden beneath his coat. If he hurts you or anyone else, it's on you, he said coldly. Don't say I didn't warn you. Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emily and Max alone in the cold, empty street. Emily knelt beside Max, her hand still resting gently on his head. His body shook beneath her touch, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. It's okay, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You're okay. We're okay. Max whined softly, nuzzling her hand. His glowing eyes, once so bright and terrifying, were now faint, like embers burning low. You saved me, she murmured, her voice trembling. Even when I was scared of you, you saved me. For a moment they stayed like that, the bond between them stronger than ever. Emily didn't know what Max truly was, or why he had come into her life, but she knew one thing. He wasn't just a monster. He was hers. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle. Max stayed by Emily's side, his behavior calmer and more predictable. The glowing in his eyes faded completely, replaced by the warm, golden-brown gaze she had always known. Caleb never returned, and Emily didn't seek him out. She didn't want to know more about Max's past or what Caleb believed he was destined to become. All she cared about was the present, the quiet walks, the playful wagging of Max's tail, the way he curled up at her feet every night like he had always belonged there. The dreams stopped too. The shadows and growls that had haunted her sleep were gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness she hadn't felt in months. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat on the porch steps of her apartment building with Max at her side. She watched as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, her hand resting lightly on Max's head. "You're still a mystery," she said softly, glancing down at him. "But maybe that's okay." Max looked up at her, his tail wagging gently. Emily smiled, her heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. Whatever Max had been, whatever he was now, she had chosen to believe in him. And for now, that was enough. As the sun set and the first stars appeared in the sky, Emily rose to her feet. "Come on, Max," she said, tugging lightly on his leash. "Let's go home." Max barked softly, his eyes bright with loyalty and love, and together they walked into the night, two souls bound by a bond that neither of them fully understood, but both of them were willing to protect. If you enjoyed this story, comment below your thoughts and opinions. Please like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.